Good morning and welcome to this morning's AIRMIC Academy, where we delve into the depths of flood risk, if you excuse the pun. For those who don't recognise my voice, I'm Patrick Smith. I'm the principal of the AIRMIC Academy, and we have a session, as I say, dealing with flood resilience. It's an exciting topic. Perhaps doesn't feel so timely as we enter into midsummer. However, summers do have a tendency of getting wetter. We'll be looking at the importance of flood risk and the impact on businesses and the provision of a simple walkthrough of the process to create a flood resilient strategy. And particularly where our organisations have high flood risk properties, the thoughts around mitigating the risk of significant unexpected impacts and large flood loss on the business is absolutely key critical, both from a risk management and an insurance perspective. So by the end of our session today, we should understand the importance of flood resilience in a time of increased flood risk, and I'm sure we'll probably touch on the environmental changes we're experiencing. We'll have an overview of the process for considering a flood resilient strategy, and we'll have all gained a better understanding of what flood resilience means in practice rather than just in theory. So that's our session today. Before we get going, let me just cover off some of the logistics. So before we hand over to our presenters, who you can see there, and I will introduce them in a moment, our session will finalise around 11 o'clock. So we'll have about 45 minutes of formal presentation, but with some excitement contained therein. So just to give you a heads up, there's going to be a couple of polls, so be on your mettle and ready to give your thoughts when the poll questions come up. And there's also a spot the difference slot, so you'll be navigated through that. And this is all to help the session be interactive and help cement our learning. So as I say, we'll break at around 11:15 for a Q&A session, which I will help moderate. So you'll see on your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see a questions drop down. So if any questions occur to you throughout the session, please just note them there and we'll pick them up before we finish after the formal presentation. If you can't see your GoToWebinar control panel at any stage, you may see on my screen, it's on the right hand side, but there's a little white arrow on a bright orange background, and that's the thing that either reveals or hides your panel. So just a tip. Now the slides you're going to see together with a recording of the session will be shared at the end. So that might influence your note taking. So you'll get all of that collateral, as well as you'll notice on your control panel, there's a handouts tab, and there's a couple of very relevant and interesting documents that at your leisure in the next hour you can pick up. They too will be available after the session. With that, I think we'll move on to our presenters. We have Ian and Bev now. Now, Ian is National Technical Manager at Sedgwick, and he's developed a service providing flood resilience surveys to the insurance market. But Ian is a flood expert. He sits on the DEFRA Resilience Roundtable and has done for a significant period of time. And is a member of the Environment Agency Property Flood Resilience Pathfinder Steering Group. So we're in good hands with Ian. We'll hear from Ian first, and thereafter we'll hear from Bev. So Dr. Bev Adams, she joined Marsh in 2012, and she and her team help UK international companies just like ours on all matters relating to resilience, and particularly deploying the PFR code of practice in a practical way, helping companies implement resistance and recoverability measures and developing flood emergency response plans, not only as part of what happens when the claim occurs, but actually before the event, thinking about these things to help mitigate the risk at renewal and just part of the risk management process. Bev actually chairs one of the PFR roundtable groups and is CAT controller for Flood Re's 24/7 rapid response service. So I think pretty much we've got industry experts, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. Please, Ian. Thank you.
That's great, Patrick. Thanks very much for the intro. It's really nice to be with you today. And we hope this will be of interest to you. If you've had a flood claim or you're concerned about flooding for the properties you look after and climate change. So let's get going. Bev and I, as it said, worked together for a number of years. We're very passionate about flood resilience and how it works and the opportunities there are to protect communities and businesses. And, you know, I've involved in this a number of years, and you see the impact emotionally and financially on businesses and on individuals. And what we've really learned over this period is there is a lot that can be done to mitigate the effects of flood risk. And really what we're trying to get across today is it's not about taking action, buying a product or a service. It's about designing that strategy that works for you and the assets that you look after. So I'm going to have a look and talk through the content you see here. I'm going to talk to the first 4 sections and then hand over to Bev, who's going to look at resilience in action. So that's how we're going to run it today. I'm looking very much at the recovery stage, and Bev will look at how we look at the possibilities for renew and refit. So the points at which you can put resilience in place. Super. So if you start by thinking about what are the risks that we've really got to be concerned about, is flooding something that really is something you should worry about? Well, obviously I'm going to say yes, aren't I? That's why we're here. But I've got some data here from the Environment Agency. They've got their new flood and coastal risk management strategy. Bit of a mouthful that, but basically it's what their concerns are for the future. So 1 billion people estimated globally at risk of flooding. And you see the stats here. The really important one, I think, is the fact that they expect 35% increase in rainfall, and this is just crystal ball gazing, by 2070, and we're doubling the building on floodplains. Well, if you're going to do that, the problems are going to get worse. So is this something that's as bad as it is going to get? No, we think it's going to get worse. Some data here from Business in the Community, a charity that deals with SMEs, looking at the impact. You can see significant impact of February storms in millions of pounds, but also the numbers of businesses that failed to reopen after significant floods. You know, we're talking high numbers that don't survive. So that and the number of lost days means the cost is significant. So the final point here is how the government strategy is changing, because the government used to say, don't worry, we'll fix it, we'll build you defences. Now, when you think about it, that most of the flooding isn't from rivers. And even the flooding that is from rivers, it isn't just rivers, it's small water courses. So if only half the flooding you might be concerned about is from rivers, of which only perhaps half the government are really trying to defend against, you're really only looking at a quarter of the risk that might work. Well, if that's a flood resilience strategy or strategy for risk reduction, I wouldn't be very happy with maybe covering a quarter of the risk. So that's why I think this is an important issue to consider. So looking at the next sort of summary really of the methodology you need to follow. So what we're saying here is the code of practice is the how-to guide. That before this was launched, and Bev and I had a nice trip to House of Parliament and a drinky poos, which was really nice. A nice trip out. So we've been involved a lot in the production of this. And it shows you how to approach making yourselves more flood resilient. So you're looking at issues such as, obviously, the sources of flooding, which we'll look at in a minute, the route the water's going to take, the hazard, what hazard that's going to be. You're looking at the history and understanding that particular location and why the flooding, how often it's occurred, how deep it is, how likely it is to occur again, what about contamination, and all of that wrapped up amongst the risk of higher flood risk in the future due to the issues I talked about before. So with all of those in mind, I'll start looking at the particular flood risk. So I'm just going to run through here the types. You probably know most of these anyway, but it's really to set the scene. So pluvial, we're talking here about surface water. So impervious surfaces, we build over our green spaces. It's talking about really dry conditions in the summer where the ground is so hard that water doesn't absorb. So that's your surface water flash floods. Fluvial, so this is rivers and streams, but everybody thinks it's about a big river, but it's about the tiny stream at the back of your factory, which hasn't been cleared out and gets blocked. That's more likely to cause you a problem. There's groundwater flooding. This is basically when the level of the water table is at ground level. So if you see a field looking like that a day or two after rain, that's because that is basically the groundwater level right sitting on the surface. A real problem for long-term flooding. And then we've got the next is tidal flooding. The East Coast are particularly prone to tidal flooding, stormwater surges, which we've had a couple of in the last 10 years. Next is sewer flooding. So this is just like the sewer and water supply to your property, which you can't predict, but just to be aware is another risk. Now this one, asset failure, everyone goes, oh, there's going to be a dam that's going to break, is there? And then we had last year, the risk of a village being inundated. But there's also small dams that, that farmers will have to store water. So there are risks that could be surrounding an asset. And the final one, which is always tricky, is compound. Now, what flooding has caused that pitch, you might ask? Well, it could be all or some or none of the above. So the question is, you have to really understand what the cause is, possible cause is, in order to protect against the risk. Right, so let's have a look at the risks and how as I said at the start, if we've got more properties at risk of surface water flooding and the government can't defend against that, we've really got an issue that we need to start being concerned about, which is flooding is not just because you're sat next to a river, and therefore understanding your flood risk. A surface water flood that goes into your factory or your offices to 100 mil doesn't sound as catastrophic as what you see on the telly, but it will stop your business trading. So it's really, really important to have an understanding of the types of flood risk. And don't just assume that because you're not near the coast or near a river that your flood risk is not going to be something to worry about. Super. Right, so we're going to look next at how we look at the stages of understanding the risk to the asset that you're responsible for. So source, I've talked a little bit about, which is where's the water coming from? So a nice schematic here. So is it a combination of rainfall and groundwater that's causing your problem? Or is it a tidal surge? Or is it a combination of two or three things together? So look at where the water will come from. Then you're looking next at the pathway. So you actually physically do this on site. So you would walk around, you drive it to where you're going, and you start looking at topography and the landscape. And when you get there, you're walking around the building to really understand how the water would access that building, how would it get there? And finally, what is the receptor? So what's the asset you're protecting? Is it a substation? Is it a factory? Is it an office? Whatever it is. So that approach also means that you've got to consider things like, as I mentioned before, the history of flooding, contamination, and the duration and frequency of floods. But the basic principle is you have to think of it in those sort of logical terms in order to really understand what the risks are. Well, we thought you don't want to hear me talking too long before we have a little bit from yourselves. So really encourage you to find, we'd like to learn a bit more. So your first sort of questions coming up now.
I'm terribly sorry. I just launched and closed the poll incredibly quickly, and now I can't reopen it. So I'm terribly sorry about that, Ian. But we can have people post into the question box what their responses are.
That would be really helpful. Yeah. So there's a question. I'm sure you've done these things before, but there's a question box where people can put their thoughts in. So anybody can just put their 3, 5, 10 or 0, something like that would be really useful. It would just give us an idea of how important this is an issue historically to you. Hopefully after this call, people will say, yeah, actually it's something we need to know more about. So I'll just give a sec there. And after that, we'll move on to the second one. Okay, So if we could perhaps bring the second one up, that'd be great. We're all clicking through now, which is great. Thank you for all putting your thoughts on the screen. Great, it was really encouraging that as predominantly you are thinking about flood risk. So we're hoping what we'll be able to show you today, and as we move on to the next slide, is how you do this really effectively. So if it's on your list of things to worry about and be concerned about, how do you really make it happen in terms of looking at the assets that you're concerned about? So I'm going to take an example of recovering resilience. So this is about when you've been flooded, if that ever was to happen, how would you recover in a resilient way and a cost-effective way? So there's a case that we're dealing with as a business, which events company in Derby. They flooded in November. There's no cover for improved resilience in the policy, so it's about funding by the business. So as part of the claims process, we did a resilience survey, engaged with insurers who were really wanting to help the customer and find a way to protect the business better. And the outcome, just to summarise it, and we'll go into more detail as we go through, is this allowed flood cover to be maintained by the customer agreeing to implement these measures. Now, normally they get on with it straight away, but COVID has delayed the implementation. But that's just a one-off situation. But so let's have a look at this example in a bit more detail. Okay, so what we've got, you'll see the River Derwent below the green space. So the river's there, the yellow dot's the building. So this is got quite a lot of high value stock because it's an events management company, so it makes props and all that sort of thing. The property is owned by the policyholder, but sublets part of the building out. So up to 1 metre of water went in, happened really quickly. So really preparations would have had to be excellent to stop it. And open to doing things differently. So it's worth thinking a bit about the building. It's a portal frame with 2 skins of blockwork. It's joined together, the 2 buildings joined together with a link, so it's a bit messy in terms of the construction. And they've got mezzanine offices, but everything else on the ground floor. So that's a sort of building. As far as resilience, they've got a lot of really good racking in there to store things, so that really helps in terms of keeping things off the floor. They've got sewing machines there for manufacturing, little manufacturing area, normal office function, toilets, canteen, area for customers. So it's quite a good mix because it's got all sorts of bits in that property, which makes it a good example, I think, of the sort of issues we face. Okay, so let's have a look at how this fits into the code of practice. Well, the code of practice talks about lots of key stages, so it's really breaking it down into obvious chunks. So the flood hazard assessment, property survey and options development. Getting to what you're going to do and why you're doing it is what we're going to do now. Also absolutely crucial is get the right contractor in stage 4 for construction, the commissioning and handover, so you know how the products and how the system works. And finally, obviously absolutely crucial, these things have got to be maintained and tested to make sure everything works. So we'll move on to looking at the first step, which is looking at this particular site. Well, we've got to look at the type of flooding, the likelihood and frequency. So we've got to do all that good stuff with the flood risk mapping and look at that particular property and see how that would be affected. So on this particular example, it's an industrial estate, and it was flooded about 20 years ago. The people currently in position weren't there then, so they asked some of the neighbours and they learned a bit more. We only got anecdotal information about depths and things there. You can see it's close to the river, but it's got problems regularly with the drains and surface water flooding outside the front of the property and down the street. So they're aware there's some issues there with surface water. So what we identified, as you see from the risks here, it's talking about for a 1 in 100 year flood, or what we call a 1% annual transfer flood, only low levels. So for fluvial and pluvial, we're only talking about sort of 250 millimeters. That moves up to really big numbers if you have a really significant fluvial flood. But when we looked at balancing the risk, we thought it would be reasonable to look to defend against 1 metre in terms of a resilience approach to deal with most flooding that could occur at the property. Okay, so let's have a look next at the next step, which is the building survey. And what we're talking about here is how we approach it. So if someone from Bev or my team would go out and do a survey, they'd be looking at the construction of the building, what's it built of, or other services supplied to the building, and some of that was a good conversation with the building representative there, who understands the building. So we really want to know how it goes together and what they know about it. We will assess the current resilient measures. They may be measures in place, or there'll be natural resilience of the building. Then we look at the option to try and decontaminate the building, because if you're going to get wet this building and affected by contamination, the question is what would have to come out, not just to dry it, but to make it safe and clean afterwards. And you're looking at adjacent structures, etc. So in order to think about this, I thought I should be really clear about what flood resilience is. So flood resilience is can be a mixture of these two approaches. Resistance, which really does what it says on the tin, which is the way you use materials or approaches or barriers, whatever it is, to manage the water entry. So you're trying to keep the water out, either entirely or to a large extent. And it's important that it doesn't always have to be completely excluding water. And flood recoverability, which is the products and the approaches you take to mean that the actual building material and the functioning of the home or business, whatever it is not unduly damaged. That means the water can come in, do limited or no damage, and go out again, and you can get back on with your life or your business. So it's quite important on this part of the survey that you have to take some time to really understand the construction, the building, learn from the person you're talking to about that structure. One of the key issues, I think, on contamination is about the way buildings are made is obviously to insulate them perhaps and make them really useful to use, but doesn't necessarily make them easy to decontaminate and after a flood. So when you're looking at resilience, you have to really get within the structure to understand what's going on so that you're not looking superficially at it. So if we have a little look on the next slide at this particular building, I'll give you a flavour of what we did. So if you look at the structure there, on that top left-hand corner, you've got profile sheeting buttoning up against the brickwork. Now, what happens here when I started looking in a bit more detail is that it's all blockwork behind that, but there's basically a hole joining those two buildings, or not joining those two buildings. So you have to look hard, otherwise the water, you do all these fantastic door barriers and everything, or flood doors, and then it just pours in the gap between. So you really have to interrogate. So the middle picture you'll see is clad, front door there, and it's clad with cedar panels. Now, how is that constructed? How would the water get through there? So you're looking at that. You're looking at heights of doors and window levels. You'll see a nice, when I walk around the back, I thought, oh, this is helpful. We've got top right-hand corner, two buildings about a hand's width apart with pipes joining the two. Now, that's not that easy to deal with. So you really have to be looking hard at the undergrowth to try and see the outside of the building and how it's built. You'll see they've got a nice wood floor at the entrance there, which is not very resilient, recoverable. And you can see another picture there of the type of doors that they've got for the normal roller shutter doors. So you need to look at the pipe penetrations, you need to look at the cracks, all sorts of things around the building to understand how it's built. So we look at this building and say, well, how resilient is this building? So, and how resilient is the operation within it? So the construction, concrete floor is good. Plaster blockwork walls, very resilient. The floor finishes aren't, because that timber floor was warped and was affected and had to be replaced, which obviously not yet done in that picture. The kitchen was non-resilient, as was the WCs and customer area. So all of it had to come out really where it was affected, which meant that they couldn't have people with welfare or cooking facilities, you know, tea and coffee, or use toilets. So that's a real problem. Organisationally, they've got some really good racking and storage, and electrical equipment was stored higher up. Fortunately, they just moved their offices to the mezzanine floor, which made a massive difference, because their business, fundamentally, they could keep people coming in to actually, you know, speak to customers and keep things going. So that was really important, but there was no documented flood plan. The customer said, yeah, we sort of got one. It's not really written down, which is my shorthand for I haven't really got one, but I don't think she wanted to admit that. So on to the next slide, step 3. is options development. So when I speak to the customer in this case, it was, right, we really understand the asset and you understand the risk you're at, and we discussed it. Now, what are you willing to or wanting to invest in, and what are you trying to defend against? So are you saying I can't have water in this building? Well, if you're in food production or electronics, you might say, well, I just got to keep this water out. That's the only option. Others may say, well, actually, if some water came, it wouldn't be a disaster, but I need the following bits of my business to be running, or my operation, if it's a charity, whatever it could be. So the decision is really against, do I do a loss prevention? Do I try to resist the water? Am I trying to say, I can't have a loss here of any description, I've got to do whatever it takes? Or is it more of a loss reduction strategy of recoverability and resistance? What's most appropriate for this business? And what I've learned is you just have to listen. You just have to really understand the business, speak to the people, delving into how their operation, how their organization runs, and what would impact them, to just try and decide the strategy. Okay, so we'll have a little look on this particular, how the options you could consider. If you wanted to keep the water out of a building or an asset, you would go, okay, let's think about put a structural wall around the building. There's a really good example from Zurich, where they have a massive flood in a factory, and they've got a lovely case study where they've built this massive wall around the building. Well, that was economic for that, but it wouldn't be for everybody. Sometimes it would be a barrier, as you can see there, around a hotel or industrial unit. On the top right-hand corner, there's automatic barriers that come down and shut to stop the water getting in. You'll see non-return valves in the drainage there to stop the water backflowing. So there's all sorts of things you can do. What we decided for this project was it could support structurally a metre of water being kept out, so it wouldn't cause structural damage. You couldn't put a barrier in place because there was too close to buildings around, a temporary barrier. The construction was okay, but there was a real risk of there water sort of leaking into the building, given it was, you know, an Australian standard portal frame structure. It was linked not very nicely, and we were worried about water ingress. So I thought to completely keep the water out was not practical, but we could massively reduce the risk of water getting in, and therefore change the whole outcome of a possible floodplain. So we went, okay, how about, by looking at this, we took two strategies. What if it got into a metre, what would it do? Well, clearly the manufacturing side would go, so there'd be some stock damage. The kitchen and welfare, even if it was recoverable, would take a lot of cleaning down. There'd be time out of operation. So really, it would be really costly to try and say, I'm just going to let this building flood to a metre and have no impact or very little impact. So we thought, well, what if we let it in? So literally, it got the concrete wet, but didn't affect the kitchen WCs or the flooring in the customer area, because that was more recoverable. How would that work? And that really clearly became the way forward. Try to keep the depth of water to a minimum, none at all, hopefully, but if it was a long-term flood and it stayed there for a while, there'll be some leakage. Then you just have to decontaminate, and you could make this better. So I'll move on to the next one, because I just want to show you quickly what this means in terms of what we did for resistance. So lots of cracks and holes in buildings. Amazing when you walk around how many bits of it are falling apart. So we need to repair those. We need to get an effective joint when those two buildings are adjacent to each other. So we put a build there to stop the water getting in. Flood barriers to door openings, non-return valves. We'll build a new structural junction where that profile sheeting was that I showed you at the start. Put a flood resilient kitchen in and toilets. We're raising the boiler, the electrics, a tile floor that looks like wood, which will look really nice, but be recoverable. Store, you know, materials that you could throw away, like wood or something at low level. So basically, we've got a strategy there, a loss reduction strategy. So then we said to the customer, we said, well, okay, that's worth explaining how it got to this point. They couldn't apply the code because it didn't exist, it wasn't published when the flood happened. They couldn't get us involved because it was sort of, came about serendipitously by Zurich saying, I think we can try and help this customer. So basically, I came in after the start of reinstatement, so we're able to help them, but not in all the ways that we would have done if we'd been involved earlier with the code released earlier. So we end up with this resilient strategy where we're trying to keep the water out, as much as possible, but realizing some may get in and therefore be recoverable. And with the current stages, we're looking at implementing the measures, but COVID is obviously holding us up on that in terms of production of the barriers and all these sorts of things. So, and key to this is this flood plan that delivers a proportionate response to the risk. And if we just move on to my last slide, this is all about us trying to understand how we can protect that particular asset. So EA warnings for river flooding can be frequent, and it is sometimes a problem that the confidence in people taking action. There's big surface water flood issues here. So we have looked at working with a company called Provisico, and they do, I believe they're the only company that does live surface water flood risk warnings. So the idea is to install a sensor in the river so we can see what the actual river level is, use the Environment Agency data for flood risk for rivers, but predictive data for surface water. So then they would get real-time alerts of when to take action and whether it was a small risk or a flood risk that needs to take immediate action. Bit of a gallop through, I realise, trying to cover quite a lot of information. At that point, I hand over to Bev, and there's questions at the end. So let's pick up anything from then that we can help you with. Bev, over to you.
Hey Ian, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, very good, thanks.
Wicked, thank you. So Ian's done a cracking job of talking about a Recover Resilient, and what we've done is we've covered over some of the ideas around resistance and recoverability. So I thought we'd start off with a bit of fun and just see if you were listening. So what we've got here is a spot the difference. On the left, you've got your before, and on the right, you've got your after. So I wondered if you'd mind, in the question window, just having a look at the two of these and then typing in what you think the major differences are between them. And we'll read them out and then we'll cover off whether they're resistance or recoverability. I'm just going to go quiet for a few seconds to give you a chance to have a look. So hopefully, as you're looking, you can see a few differences. I'm eagerly looking at the question window to see whether you guys can type in some of the differences that you're able to spot. Ian, I can't hear you.
I said to Bev, there's no prizes for this one, unfortunately, is there?
Looks like folks are not really too happy to enter that stuff. So, oh, here we go. We've got some. Starter for 10. Thanks, Dave. So, floodgates, very good. So, a classic resistance strategy. One of those ones where we would aim to keep the water out entirely, or at worst, allow what we would call a carpet wetter. Raised stock, very good. So, one of those very low cost resilience activities. If you raise your stock up, then you're going to be protecting yourself. Anything that is at floor level must be considered sacrificial. Flood defences, very good. Obviously, we have that flood wall all the way around the property, potentially quite an expensive measure. And so that's not something that we take lightly, making that kind of recommendation. I've got another good one, drainage in the warehouse floor. Very good. You'll notice that the floors are different colours. As Ian mentioned, in our case of the claim in Derby, one of the things that very often happens is that the flooring is warped. Our goal with resistance is if you flood on a Friday, how can your business be up and running on a Monday? And very often that calls for us to replace the floor and also do another measure, which I'm searching for. Okay, haven't spotted it there, but another one is to put sump pumps into the floor to then speed up the removal of water, as well as making the floor resilient in its own right. Right, let's see what else we've got here. Okay, there are a few that haven't yet been picked up. So I'm just going to give you guys, flood level measure. Very good, Liam. Okay, so someone's got sharp eyes and has spotted on the outside of the building in the right-hand corner a white pole, which is actually a parametric flood sensor. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the new kinds of flood insurance, but that's a sensor for a company called Flood Flash. Ian, would you like to give me a couple of others, my friend?
Yeah, I've got to, now I'm under pressure. I think I might be on mute here. I don't know. No, I'm not on mute. I see my phone ring. Yeah, so we've got electrics raised, I believe, in one of our pictures there.
Very good. That's it. Important. Otherwise, you're going to fry your electrics, and such a simple change to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got I don't think air brick covers have come up. This is a schematic, obviously, as Bev has shown, so you wouldn't necessarily have these in exactly the point they're shown on the diagram, but they give you a good example of what's there.
Thank you. So when we were in Derby looking at the claim together, Ian, these were some of the key things that we saw, weren't they? Areas where potentially there were alternative ways that the water could enter the building, and those kind of things that in a traditional survey just wouldn't be picked up. What Ian hasn't mentioned is that both of us have been through the flood surveyors resilience training, and so it opens your eyes and it enables you to see your asset with a completely different view. And so for us now, when we're just going around looking at buildings, even my own home, I have quite a different perspective in terms of the ability to keep water out versus the scenario where water may have to enter and be quickly whisked away. And we call that living with water. So thanks, guys, for joining in on that. Particular thumbs up to Dave, Calvin, Sarah, and Liam. Thanks very much. What I'm going to do now is just move on to some more details about flood resilience in action. And so every day at the moment, I wake up and I deal with flooding. And Ian's been talking today about what we call recover resilient. But in my world, I'm dealing with renew resilient, refit resilient, design resilient, and invest resilient. Because in my job at Marsh Risk Consulting, I work with companies all across the spectrum, whether it's asset managers, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's water companies, manufacturing businesses, food companies, all of them all have this thought that either flood risk or climate change is a factor or could become a factor. And so we've been incredibly busy this year and towards the back end of last year dealing with floods, but also helping companies prepare for how they can handle floods. And part of this has been driven by the need to take appropriate risk management action. But in reality, part of it's also been driven by renewals. We now have a hard insurance market. And for any of you who've been through renewal or are going through renewal, you may be finding that if you have assets with flood risk, it's being called out and the terms that are being imposed upon you aren't very favourable. So in reality, I am doing a little bit of firefighting at the moment, helping companies who are having difficult renewals literally identify a strategy and a roadmap for taking action to both get better terms, but also the double benefit that that's then going to help them have a more resilient business. And that's small businesses, large businesses, it's businesses in the UK, it's also international. So as you can imagine, COVID's not been particularly quiet. In fact, quite the opposite. It's been really busy. But I'll talk a little bit more about the detail of some of the case studies in a moment. Before I get to that, what I wanted to do was just walk you through the very simple steps that this looks like. So let's say, for example, you're a business who has a portfolio of assets. Do you know which of your assets are at risk of flood? Ian earlier spoke brilliantly about the different sources. This is a non-trivial subject. And as you may know, there are specialist models available for helping us to do that diagnostic. And so that's one of the key steps at the beginning, know where you have flood risk. And that helps you then to prioritise and focus on in. You can bet your bottom dollar that the insurers will be doing that. And so one of my key messages are, let's level the playing field and let's not have any uncomfortable surprises where they know that you have a risk, but perhaps you don't know yourself. That doesn't make for a happy renewal situation. And so that's why I'm really committed to driving this early diagnostic, so everyone knows where that risk is. And that then gives us a chance to help develop the strategy to manage it. So maybe some of you already know where your flood risks are, but do you know where they are if you were to add climate change? And we work on a 2-degree warming scenario by 2040. And so the way that we're looking at it is your risk today, but then also your risk in a future-proof manner. I don't own the models. I work with a company called JBA. We license their models because, frankly, they are the best and they provide feedback for us, which is very detailed and down to the asset level. And for me, I also often look at the EA maps, but quite often they're out of date. They do have a new program, the EA called NAFRA 2, but that's 3 years away. And so I'm committed to using the best that's available to us today. So that's step 1, know where you've got flood risk. Step 2 is the survey. Now, Ian's spoken about doing a survey after a claim, but it's equally as important to do a survey before an event ever happens, because otherwise, how do you know why you have flood risk and what you should do about it? Okay, I'm going to tell you you have risk at a site, but why is that? And as Ian rightly said, are there any mitigating circumstances in place already? And if not, how should I be thinking about it? So that's the first very practical step. And COVID absolutely threw us a curveball because we were very busy, we needed to do surveys, and yet we're not able necessarily to travel as extensively. And I will talk in a moment about the remote survey methodology, where we had to pivot. So we were then leveraging our knowledge from our desktop, rather like today, but also leveraging the skills of our clients' teams who are local. So in a way, that partnership of us having the knowledge at my desk, your companies having the eyes and ears on the ground, means that we've been able to keep going the minute people were able to get back into their facilities. But more about that later. So the survey ends up with a list of recommendations, and Ian, you've brilliantly gone through exactly how we start looking at it for our Derby case study. So then let's get real, implement. We are risk managers. We are practical people. We need to have flood emergency response plans. We need to have strategies for how to manage it. We need to have protocol documents. We need to have refit schedules. We need to have practical tools that become part of our risk management toolkit handling flood. And that's super critical. And as Marsh Risk Consulting, obviously, that's what we do to help build those. Let's say we then have that very tight program in place. What does that then mean when it comes to insurance? So I've mentioned that we're at the moment going through some renewal nightmares, and I can't talk specifics today because that wouldn't be appropriate for the companies involved. I can just say that we've seen 120% premium increases. We've seen deductibles increase from 10K up to 500K. We've seen co-insurance requirements. We've seen denial of cover. It's definitely messy. And so it's my job to help along that journey, smooth the way and ensure that people can get insurance cover. Some of the things that I'll talk about as well are parametrics, also some of the resilience wordings. Did you know that you can actually get an insurance policy that has resilience built in? So if you were to have a claim, you can get £100,000 worth of actual resilience measures that would be included as part of the reinstatement. Super important, but I don't know that that's well-known fact. So more on insurance in a minute. And then lastly, monitor. So we've got these great plans in place. We've got all of the necessary protocols. But in terms of what are we doing day to day? I'm on 24/7 call for Flood Re because we have a national forecasting and monitoring program that we've been working on for the last 3 years that we're hoping to now take so that other businesses can begin benefiting from that. Ian's mentioned some of the data sources, EA, Provisco, but there are others as well that monitor groundwater, actual water levels within rivers. And so Flood Re have been our thought partner on that. And I love that because in a way, they're the ones who for the residential community have been chartered with changing the whole way that we look at flooding, going away from this idea that we've got to only keep the water out to the idea of living with water. So I will be able to do more on the monitoring piece, and I'll happily take questions on that outside of this call today. So That's a lot of chatter about the 5-step process. I'm going to now give you some feedback on specific case studies that we've seen in the last couple of months. So, as I mentioned, we are working with all kinds of businesses that own assets, infrastructure, large, small, transport companies, public authorities, private businesses. Some have been flooded, some have not yet been flooded, some have been penalised. And so very much it's active work. So while I'm not able to name names, what I would do was suggest that you have a look at the brochure that's added on and you can download, because we've got some links to our website which has got some anonymised case studies. So the first one that I'm going to do today is a Renew Resilient case study. So this one came across my desk about 2 months ago, and normally when we start a renewal process, it starts 6 months ahead of the actual renewal. And so I wouldn't normally be finding out about a flood issue 2 months before the renewal. But this was a slightly odd situation where everything was moving through, and then I think it's a symbol of the changing times. The insurer involved all of a sudden made a decision, having run a flood model, that they were going to impose terms for 31 sites where they believed that there was flood risk, and they were increasing the excess from £10,000 to, believe it or not, £500,000 for each one of those 31 sites. And so this hit us literally 2 months before renewal. And on top of that, there had been a flood claim in Rotherham back in November. So we knew about that one, and we had a good strategy in place for managing that one, but these other 31 were unexpected. And that's a very good reason why the diagnostic is dead helpful, because it helps you know where your risks are, so you're not going to have that kind of uncomfortable surprise. So we got pulled in, and the key idea here was to develop a roadmap in partnership with the insurer to ensure that they were comfortable that the business was taking flooding seriously and putting appropriate measures in place. So we're doing this project at the moment, and the strategy that's been deployed is what we're calling virtual surveys, where for each one of the 32 sites, we have done the prep work from our desk, i.e. we've done all the mapping, we've done the terrain modelling, we've got the hydraulic models, and we then have guided a member of the builders merchants team around the site, where we are at our desktop, we're using Microsoft Teams, and they have an iPhone, very simple, but they are our eyes and ears on the ground. And through that, because we're qualified flood surveyors, we've been able to identify all of the things that Ian was talking about, but then develop really good, realistic strategies with the company so that they've got that plan in place. And that is what the insurer wanted. Now, I don't know how many of you who are on the call today have heard of bursaries, but if you have an insurance cover, then you may have a bursary, which is an allocation of funds to be able to do risk management. And in many instances, the insurers are very open to those things being used for flood protection surveys and also works. Now, I know I can see we're running a little short on time, so let me move through the other case studies. If we could go to Renew Resilient B, this is one again that's ongoing at the moment, but we started much earlier in the journey. So 6 months out, we now know that they have a number of sites which are at heavy risk of flood as well. Now, these were the ones who had very challenging renewal terms. Interesting story, they had a 3-year insurance program. When that came to an end, when the program, Marsh took over the program 3 years ago, before that, there had been a flood claim, but we didn't know anything about it because we don't have eyes necessarily on those claims before we take over as the broker. There was one in 2019, we knew about that. So the first that we knew that there was significant risk for this site, this company, was when one of the insurers asked what their flood resilience and operational strategy was. And in all fairness, they're a very good company, well managed, excellent health and safety record, but they didn't have a solid flood plan. So the renewal went as such: 4 denials of coverage, some horrendous terms. We have eventually landed in a place where we've got a very nice deal for them, which is actually £60,000 cheaper in terms of premium, but it does have a large excess of 250,000 for one site and 25k for the other that was flooded. Now, this is where our new insurance coverages that are parametric come in as an infill. You can buy those as a standalone cover that then sits and protects you for that amount of excess. So it means that if you do some resilience and you take that parametric, then those two things combined mean that you don't have to retain £250,000 worth of risk on your balance sheet. So we've just closed that. And because of the saving that they made on the premium and the relatively low cost of the parametric, they've got some money in the bank to do some resilience works. Because I'm sure some of you will be wondering, how do we fund this? How expensive is it? And one of the things that Ian and I are working on is a tool and a model to help do that cost benefit analysis of which measures make most sense, which ones stack up economically. So moving swiftly on to case study number 4. This one is a landed estate with a large number of properties around the UK, very proactive in their mindset because they are in a way curators of the future of that business. So they have tasked us, we identified the key sites, they're currently going through a programme of works where they're developing the surveys and then doing refit schedules, and then we're actually training their in-house surveyors so that going forward they'll be able to do their own works to then assess the resilience potential and make the right kind of decisions. So any questions that you may have after this today about these case studies and others that we're working on, absolutely shoot us a note. Emails for Ian and myself are at the end. So just moving on quickly, what I want to do is just provide you with some final thoughts and, in a way, a call to action. Ian and I have today spoken about some of the practical ways in which we're seeing flood resilience in action. But I would remind you that if you have portfolios of assets, if you have assets that are overseas, if you have concerns about climate risk, if you're not just looking at it operationally, but also looking ahead to TCFD and PRA disclosures for financial climate risk, these are all things where we can help you understand what that risk is today and put the right measures in place. So we like to talk about invest resilient, renew resilient, design resilient, refit resilient, and then recover resilient. And what we'd like to do after the session today is open our door to answer any questions that you may have, just to help you make a difference on flooding and climate change within your business. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Outstanding presentation. Just a reminder to everybody online that there are a couple of handouts in the handouts tab, so they will be circulated, but feel free to pick them up. Just a couple of questions before we wrap up. Marina has highlighted that burst mains risk has not really been mentioned. So I think the question here is maybe one for you, Ian. Do you think that the risk of burst mains is something that's accelerating, increasing, is static, or improving by the actions of perhaps the water authorities, you know, internationally potentially? What's your feeling?
Yeah, well, I would say that we often have, repeat offenders. So there's an area where the main or the supply is failed previously in the past, and then I think it's an area where you have some sort of prediction that the risk might happen again, and therefore action can be taken. Obviously, the completely unforeseen event that's never happened before in an area, you know, is not something that you could predict or defend against. I think it's sort of where areas are more susceptible to failure and there's history of it, then I think then there starts to become planning in that way. As far as the quality of long-term number of escapes, I don't know, to be honest, as a stat. But yeah, you know, it's a difficult one because it's so hard to predict. All the other risks, at least you can put some sort of number against. That is obviously a harder one. But there is history in the areas sometimes because they mend one link and it pops somewhere else. So, you know, the point is it's old infrastructure.
Yeah. So it's a risk that sounds like without major investment is going to be with us in some.
I think so, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the big challenges, of course, for risk managers, and I'm sure all of our attendees today will be nodding away, is that as diligent risk managers, we really understand the kind of concepts that you're talking about, but it's important to turn the heads of our exec. So can you give us an insight as the extent to which the kind of methodology you're suggesting can actually, if you like, quantify the risk or quantify the benefits of taking the mitigations you've described? Because of course, organizations choose how to spend their money, and I'm wondering how this might support the business case.
If I could comment on that one.
Yeah, Bev, yeah.
So one of the things that Ian and I are deeply aware of is the need to be able to do this cost benefit analysis. And so back in April, we started our own initiative to develop a toolkit where when we're looking at an individual facility, looking at the options for resilience that are available, and then how the benefits of those options vary as you increase the depth of flooding and the level of protection. Because we're very well aware that when you're putting together a programme of works, the perception can be that it's very costly. And so that idea of designing a simple way to then measure and justify the different measures, whether you're going for a partial resistance, whether you're going for recoverability, we're very well aware that that's needed. One thing that I would add is that the code of practice is a very practical tool which provides guidance on what to do at an individual site. But what it's not done is provided metrics around scoring. And so in the round table, we've now launched the code, and one of our key next steps is to develop that scoring mechanism. And so that would help what you said, because if, for example, your resilience level on day one was very low, say a 2 out of 10, but then after you've done those works, it becomes an 8 or 9 or even 10 out of 10, then that's a tangible benefit that can then be shown to insurers, investors, leadership within the business. We're very conscious that's needed. So number one, we're working on it because we're doing surveys and we're providing recommendations every day, and we know people have to have this. Also, on a much bigger sense, as part of the round table, we know that we as a nation need to have that kind of scoring.
Superb, thank you very much. Well, I think we're drawing to a close, and just some sort of final remarks. I think what you've positioned very clearly for us is that living with water is another way of saying water's not going away anytime soon. So whatever the kind of cause of potential flood risk, and particularly with the burgeoning climate change, this is a situation to be managed, almost certainly something that would be hard to eliminate. I think what you've also positioned really well is the challenging insurance market on the property classes. And, I'm reassured by your comments around bursary, but I think from a risk management perspective, we'd all like insurance benefit to be an aftermath of a really proactive risk management strategy. So to your point, having to do emergency things kind of 6 weeks out from renewal may feel a little after the fact rather than a cohesive risk management strategy. So I think making insurability a sort of an outcome rather than a driver is a sensible mindset. Where we think about forward thinking and, particularly for those organizations who perhaps have not had the emotion of a large flood event, I think what COVID teaches all of us is no one can ever say again, it'll never happen to us. So I think the advice around understanding what your flood risk is and then prioritizing from there is a great approach. And then also, I think finally, just integrating sort of mitigation activity, whether that's after the event and skillfully kind of, rebuilding in a far more resilient way rather than simply reinstating like for like, or where many property portfolios go through processes of refurbishment and maintenance, maybe with an eye open to the flood risk, is a really sensible way to do that. I think the handouts that you provided us, together with the Spot the Difference, which I thought was a great visual checklist actually, gives us real food for thought. I think we can not say this will never happen to us, but I think with some of the knowledge you provided today, you've given us real insights. So I thank you for that. So just before we finalise, just to remind you, the slides will be circulated, as will the recording. Thank you very much for your engagement. Just to remind you that the AIRMIC mentoring scheme has launched during May, so there's still opportunities to engage there. Have a look at the airmic.com website, and of course we're warming up to AIRMIC Fest, so keep your eyes open for developments on that front. So with that, let me say thank you sincerely to the guys here for their terrific presentation, great information, and thank you everybody for attending, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.